Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now back in 2016 the GTX 1080 was the performance king. If you wanted to play games without compromise, then one of these would have been the way to go. The Ti version came out the following year and snatched the crown, but the 1080 still remains impressive even to this day. I picked up this Windforce 3X OC edition very recently, and today I want to see how it handles itself in some of my favourite new games. Before we get into the settings I'd recommend for a 60 FPS experience in 2022, let's see how it does when we crank the visuals up to Ultra, something this card would have had no problem with half a decade ago. This is the maxing out modern games test. If you want to run games at their respective highest settings these days, then you'll be best off at 1080p. But all of the titles I tested, except for Cyberpunk of course, still managed to hit at least 60 FPS, which is very impressive in my eyes. This is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I still wouldn't necessarily recommend cranking everything up to maximum because the slight differences in visual quality over say high settings isn't worth the performance you're losing over the slightly lower presets. That goes for pretty much all of the benchmarks in this video. If you're happy with the performance you've seen so far, then the 1080 is still very much the card for you, and I'm glad to have helped you with your purchasing decision. In the next part of the video, I want to talk about the settings I'd recommend at both 1080p and 1440p instead. Settings that will keep the games looking visually impressive, but allow you to hit a more consistent 60 frames per second. Settings that will help to avoid the big dips below this figure. The next part is therefore called My Recommended Settings. The name does need a little bit of work. Let's start off with Cyberpunk 2077. This is probably where we'll have to make the biggest sacrifice. Now at 1080p, the medium preset with the high texture quality and medium crowd density combines great visuals with decent performance. As you know, I usually stick to presets when testing for simplicity's sake. You guys can then match the settings easily if you're happy with what you see in terms of frame rate in the video. As I mentioned, the only setting I've changed outside of the medium preset is the texture quality, just to add a little more crispiness to the overall presentation. For 60 FPS at 1440p we're going to need the low settings all round. Even so, I'd actually avoid 1440p here because while 60 is an average, the only time you'll see it consistently is in emptier areas of the map. Downtown will cause dips to the mid-40s and that's where things will stay a lot of the time. This is absolutely fine of course if you're happy with a plus 30 FPS average, and all of the games tested today could probably be pushed a little higher in terms of their quality settings at 1440p instead. That said, Cyberpunk here does a great job of looking great at low, especially when we've got the extra sharpness of the high resolution thrown into the mix. For Far Cry 6 I'd recommend high instead of the highest because this ensures that our 1% low figure is slightly better, which means that we see less significant drops as the action heats up. Again, some of you might not mind this, but this is why I've shown you what the card can do at maximum settings in this video as well. The 1080 is very much a 1080p card for ultra settings gaming as we head into this new year. Just like the first time around, I'm not using the HD texture pack because I don't think they're worth the extra hard drive space, but it's up to you if you want to try them out. They are free after all. A 1% low figure is now also closer to 60, so overall things do feel a bit smoother than they did previously. At 1440p, Far Cry 6 also did surprisingly well on the 1080. I had to turn things down to medium, but the game's tropical landscapes still look fantastic, and with a 67 FPS average it plays really nicely too. I've got to admit I paid £350 for this card, which is more than I did a couple of years ago when I bought another Gigabyte model, but this was still the cheapest I could find, and it's £150 cheaper than any 2060 I could get. I believe these two perform quite closely to each other, or at least they used to. For San Andreas Definitive Edition, I'd recommend just sticking with the max settings. There are going to be noticeable frame dips and drops anyway, no matter the graphical options you use, so why not leave things as they are? That said, I'd suggest enabling the frame rate cap to suit your monitor's refresh rate, as this will make things feel smoother overall, and the dips that do occur won't feel as noticeable. That would probably be my recommendation as opposed to leaving it unlocked. Now 1440p will require some light tweaking. The high graphics preset and the lowering of both vehicle lighting and street lighting will guarantee us a plus 60 FPS average, but again, the frame dips and drops that we've been able to eliminate from titles so far stick with us here. An FPS cap might also be a good idea this time around. The performance does seem to be improved from launch, things are smoother overall for sure, and some of the environments really do look quite stunning. Battlefield 2042's performance varies so much from map to map. Some will perform well but exhibit not so great percentile figures, and some will be consistently smooth. It's why I take an average from 3 online games. The highest settings I demonstrated at the start of the video are fine, but to sort of make up or account for some of the maps, I'd suggest the high preset instead, which will not only improve overall consistency across all of the in-game maps, but it will also improve the 1% low, which is important for online competitive shooters such as this. No one wants to line an enemy up in their sights only to miss them when the game decides to lag. You can achieve a similar performance outcome at 1440p by switching to the low preset. Again, a 3-game average was taken, but the footage is from an AI match for convenience sake. To be honest, I'd probably stick with 1080p and enjoy the higher visual quality across all of today's games so far, as opposed to lowering things for 1440p, but it depends on the game and it depends on your monitor, of course. This isn't always necessary though, as I'll demonstrate with Fortnite. Now Fortnite will stutter quite badly if you max it out at 1080p with a GTX 1080, and while I couldn't get rid of the performance problems entirely, high settings certainly helped. This is an older game than the others I've tested today, but it still gets updates and it's still very much relevant. For 1440p, I actually kept the settings the same. I used the high preset once again. I'd probably use 1440p with perhaps slightly lower settings, but overall, high is fine. To be honest, I was pretty happy with the Forza Horizon 5 highest settings performance that I showed you at the start. The average figures were decent and the lows were also good, but in certain busier areas of the map, keeping things maxed out will cause a few more problems, so it's good to have a bit of breathing room. This does mean that when not much is going on, the frame rate can exceed 100 FPS, but entering multi-competitor races that will put more stress on the system can cause it to dip a bit, and reducing things from extreme to ultra instead gives us a more consistent experience. What a fantastic looking game though, and I say that regardless of the settings. Now just like Fortnite, I kept the same preset for 1440p because we were still getting at least 60 FPS on average without any problems. This actually felt a tiny bit smoother here in terms of the frame drops. This is a well optimized game and it really shows. It's nice to see the GTX 1080 doing so well. In Halo Infinite, I'm happy to leave the highest settings as my recommendation for 1080p because when I turned things down, the 0.1% low figure actually dropped a bit for some reason. This happened on both of my test runs, so I thought, why not leave things at max? You still get a higher average with lower settings, or if you want to, you could set a minimum frame rate to enable the adaptive resolution. I found that setting it to 75 FPS to match my monitor's refresh rate actually boosted the performance to about 100 FPS, with what was not a very noticeable change in visual quality, so that's definitely worth considering. I didn't make use of stuff like that for the benchmarks here, or for any game I tested today, as I wanted to focus on the native performance this time around. The game was tested with a big team battle. Moving on to 2560 by 1440, and again a big team battle was used for benchmarking. Here 1440p with the low preset was used for a plus 60 FPS. All in all, the 1080 is still pretty impressive. The TI version, even more so as you can imagine, but that costs a whole lot more during these trying times. All I can say is that if you are considering buying a new 2060, for example, keep an eye out for a second-hand 1080. It depends on how you feel about used hardware though, especially now. It can be hard to determine the past life of any graphics card at the moment. The GTX 1080 though, what a beast. Even as we enter 2022, it can still max out games at 1080p with decent performance, and it will still make light work of pumping out respectable figures at 1440p with reduced visual quality. That's all for this one then. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know what you think of the card down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one, when we'll be testing God of War with no graphics card.